The limousine's headlights cut through the November rain as it turned onto Madison Avenue, its occupant hidden behind tinted windows that reflected the neon glow of 1960 Manhattan. Barry Goldwater pressed himself deeper into the leather seat, his mind racing with the implications of what he was about to do. In his pocket lay an invitation that could destroy his political career before it truly began. A handwritten note from Cardinal Francis Joseph Spellman, the most powerful Catholic prelate in America. St. Patrick's Rectory. Midnight. Come alone. Burn this message. The senator from Arizona had burned the paper, but its words remained seared in his memory. 3 days had passed since its delivery by a young priest who had appeared at Goldwater's hotel room, spoken 6 words, "His Eminence requests your immediate attention," and vanished into the crowd outside the Waldorf Astoria. Now, as the car approached the cathedral's Gothic spires, Goldwater understood he was crossing a line that no Republican politician dared approach. The year 1960 had turned American politics into a religious battlefield, with John F. Kennedy's Catholicism becoming the central, unspoken issue of the presidential race. Protestant ministers thundered from pulpits about papal control. Voters whispered about divided loyalties. And here was Barry Goldwater, the rising conservative star, secretly meeting with the very embodiment of American Catholic power. The driver, selected for his discretion, pulled into a narrow alley behind the rectory. No words were exchanged as Goldwater stepped into the rain, collar turned up against both the weather and recognition. A door opened before he could knock, revealing a young Monsignor whose eyes betrayed nothing. "Senator. This way." They climbed stairs that creaked with age, passing portraits of stern-faced bishops who seemed to judge this Protestant interloper in their sacred space. The Monsignor stopped at an unmarked door, knocked 3 times and departed without waiting for a response. "Enter," came a voice from within, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. The room Goldwater entered defied every expectation. Instead of the ornate grandeur he anticipated, he found himself in a sparse chamber lit only by candles and a single desk lamp. Cardinal Spellman sat behind a simple wooden desk, his scarlet zucchetto the only splash of color in the monochrome space. But it was the second figure that made Goldwater's breath catch, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, sitting in shadow like a specter at a séance. "Senator Goldwater," Spellman said, not rising. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. You know Director Hoover, I believe." "Your Eminence." "Edgar." Goldwater remained standing, uncertain of the protocol, wary of the trap he might be entering. "Sit, Barry," Hoover said, his voice carrying its familiar mixture of command and threat. "We're all friends here. Or rather, we all have common enemies." Goldwater took the indicated chair, his military training keeping his posture rigid despite the surreal circumstances. "With respect, Your Eminence, I'm not sure why I'm here. If this is about the election." "The election is already lost," Spellman interrupted, his words carrying the weight of prophecy. "Kennedy will be president. The question is what comes after." The Cardinal rose, moving to a wall map of the world marked with red pins, communist nations spreading like a disease across continents. "Senator, I asked you here because you're one of the few politicians who understands the true threat. Not Kennedy's Catholicism, which is barely more than a social convenience. But what lurks behind the rhetoric of change in youth." "Communism," Goldwater said. "Precisely." Spellman's fingers traced the Iron Curtain. "And while Protestant ministers waste breath on fears of papal control, the real enemy grows stronger. Cuba has fallen. Khrushchev grows bolder. And our next president." He paused, choosing words carefully, "lacks the steel necessary for the coming confrontation." Hoover leaned forward into the light, his bulldog features set in familiar determination. "The Cardinal and I have been sharing intelligence, Senator. What we've discovered requires someone with your particular combination of military experience and political courage." "Intelligence about what?" Spellman returned to his desk, withdrawing a folder marked with classification stamps Goldwater recognized from his Air Force service. "About infiltration. Not the fantasies peddled by McCarthy, he was a drunk swinging at shadows. But real, documented penetration of American institutions." The folder's contents made Goldwater's hands tremble slightly, names, dates, connections mapping a web of influence that reached into labor unions, universities, even government agencies. But what struck him most was the religious dimension, how communist operatives had specifically targeted the divide between Catholics and Protestants, inflaming suspicions to weaken American unity. "They're using our faith against us," Goldwater muttered. "Exactly." Spellman's eyes blazed with conviction. While we tear ourselves apart over theological differences that haven't mattered since the Reformation, they advance. The question, Senator, is whether you're willing to help stop them. What are you proposing? The Cardinal and the FBI director exchanged glances before Spellman spoke. An alliance. Invisible to the public but decisive in action. You have credibility with conservative Protestants that neither Edgar nor I could ever achieve. We have resources, intelligence networks, and influence in communities you cannot reach. You want me to be your Protestant face. I want you to help save Christian civilization, Spellman replied without irony. The doctrinal differences between us are real, Senator. I believe you're destined for damnation without the sacraments of Holy Mother Church. You believe I'm enslaved to papal superstition. But we both believe in God, freedom, and the American way of life. In this struggle, that must be enough. Goldwater stood, pacing to the window that overlooked Fifth Avenue. Below, late-night traffic moved through rain-slicked streets, oblivious to the momentous conversation above. What you're asking? It goes against every principle of transparent democracy. Democracy without survival is meaningless, Hoover interjected. We're already at war, Barry. The only question is whether we fight back or surrender through inaction. And if I refuse? Spellman's voice carried no threat, only resignation. Then you return to Arizona, run for president in 1964 as expected, and lose because the country will have moved too far left to hear your message. Meanwhile, the infiltration continues, the divisions deepen, and by 1970. He spread his hands in a gesture of futility. You've thought this through. I've prayed over it, the Cardinal corrected. Do you think I wanted to reach out to a man who represents everything my Irish Catholic flock has been taught to distrust? But God works through imperfect vessels. Moses was a murderer. Paul persecuted Christians. Perhaps he can work through a Jewish Episcopal conservative and a Roman cardinal. The reference to Goldwater's Jewish heritage, rarely mentioned in public discourse, showed the depth of Spellman's intelligence. But rather than offense, Goldwater felt a strange kinship. Here was another man who understood the burden of being an outsider within his own movement. Tell me specifically what this alliance would involve. For the next 2 hours, they laid out a plan that was breathtaking in scope and audacity. Using Goldwater's political network and Spellman's religious infrastructure, they would create an informal intelligence system to counter communist influence. Protestant ministers and Catholic priests, traditionally suspicious of each other, would share information about subversive activities in their communities. Business leaders from both faiths would coordinate to prevent union infiltration. Universities would be monitored for radical professors targeting religious students. And 1964? Goldwater asked. You run as expected, Spellman said. But with our quiet support, you reshape the conservative message. Less about Protestant versus Catholic, more about believers versus atheistic communism. Win or lose, you transform American conservatism into something that transcends denominational lines. The public can never know about this meeting. The public sees what we show them, Hoover said with practiced cynicism. They'll see you as the principled conservative, me as the vigilant lawman, His Eminence as the spiritual leader. They don't need to know we're coordinating. Goldwater turned from the window. I need guarantees. No surveillance of political opponents. No blackmail. No violation of American law. Agreed, Spellman said quickly, too quickly Goldwater thought. We're not creating an American Gestapo, Senator. We're creating a watchdog with teeth. And Kennedy? The question hung in the air like incense. Finally, Spellman spoke, his voice heavy with the burden of criticizing a fellow Catholic. The president-elect will be informed of general threats but not our specific alliance. His brother Robert, however? He glanced at Hoover, who nodded grimly. Bobby's too close to the radicals, the FBI director said. He thinks he can control them, use them. He'll learn otherwise, but by then damage will be done. We need to be ready. The candles had burned low by the time they finished, wax pooling on ancient wood. Goldwater stood to leave, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd agreed to. As he reached the door, Spellman called out. Senator, one more thing. This Sunday, Protestant ministers across the country will deliver sermons about the Catholic threat. Some quite virulent. I need you to speak out against them. That could cost me politically. Yes. But it will signal to those who need to know that something has changed. That the old divisions no longer serve their purpose. Goldwater nodded slowly. I'll need something in return. A Catholic voice defending my character when I'm attacked as an extremist. Done. Spellman smiled for the first time that night. Politics makes strange bedfellows, Senator, but Providence makes stranger ones still. The ride back to the hotel passed in a blur of consideration and calculation. Goldwater knew he had crossed a Rubicon, entering into an alliance that violated every principle of open democratic discourse. Yet the threat outlined in that sparse room seemed to justify extraordinary measures. Was this how democracy died, he wondered, not in violent revolution but in quiet meetings where good men decided the people couldn't be trusted with truth? 3 days later, Goldwater stood before the Phoenix Press Club, delivering a speech that sent shockwaves through political circles. Religious bigotry has no place in American politics, he declared, his voice carrying the conviction of the newly converted. Those who question John Kennedy's patriotism because of his faith are as un-American as those who would impose atheism by force. In the coming struggle against communism, we need every believer, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, standing together. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Protestant ministers who had counted on Goldwater's support felt betrayed. Conservative donors threatened to withdraw funding. But within hours an unexpected voice rose in defense. Cardinal Spellman, in a carefully worded statement, praised Goldwater's principled stand against the politics of division. The media, always alert to unusual alliances, noted the oddity but missed the deeper story. They saw political calculation where there was strategic coordination. They reported on public statements while the real communication flowed through channels they couldn't imagine. A Baptist minister in Alabama passing information to a Catholic priest in Chicago, both reporting to contacts who ensured the intelligence reached appropriate authorities. By January 1961, as Kennedy prepared for inauguration, the alliance had evolved beyond its creator's original vision. What began as 3 men in a candlelit room had expanded into a network of hundreds, all united by anti-communism and guided by an invisible hand that traced back to that midnight meeting. Goldwater met regularly with intermediaries, never again directly with Spellman to avoid suspicion. Information flowed through cutouts and dead drops that Hoover's FBI facilitated without official documentation. They identified communist study groups forming on campuses, labor organizers with suspicious connections, and even government employees whose loyalty seemed questionable. But success bred temptation. Some within the network pushed for more aggressive action. Blackmail of suspected sympathizers, intimidation of radical professors, even violence against particularly dangerous operatives. Goldwater found himself constantly restraining overzealous patriots who saw communist plots in every disagreement. The crisis came in March 1962, when a young Catholic priest in Detroit uncovered what he believed was a communist cell planning to infiltrate the auto unions. Following network protocol, he passed the information up the chain. But instead of waiting for proper investigation, local members decided to act, confronting the suspects in a violent encounter that left 2 men hospitalized. Goldwater flew immediately to New York, meeting Spellman in a different location, a construction site for a new Catholic school, where the noise of machinery provided cover for heated conversation. "This has to stop," Goldwater insisted. "We're becoming what we swore to fight against." Spellman, looking older than his years, nodded wearily. "I've excommunicated the priest involved. But Barry, we can't control everyone who believes in the cause. Then we shut it down. And let the communists win by default?" The cardinal's voice carried anguish. "Do you know what I saw in Poland after the war? What godless communism does to believers? I won't let it happen here. Neither will I. But not through thuggery. We're supposed to be better than them." Their argument continued for an hour, 2 men of principle wrestling with the corruption that power inevitably brings. Finally, they reached a compromise. The network would continue but with new restrictions, new oversight, and immediate expulsion for anyone who violated legal boundaries. The Detroit incident, reported in local papers as a labor dispute, served as a warning. The network pulled back, refocused on intelligence gathering rather than direct action. But the seed of corruption had been planted, and Goldwater knew it was only a matter of time before it flowered into something neither he nor Spellman could control. Through 1963, as Kennedy struggled with Cuba, Vietnam, and civil rights, the Shadow Alliance provided intelligence that may have prevented several catastrophes. A planned bombing of a Birmingham church was stopped when network members overheard planning discussions. A Soviet attempt to infiltrate the aerospace industry was exposed through coordinated surveillance. Even Kennedy benefited, though he never knew the source of certain crucial intelligence that reached his desk through circuitous routes. But success in shadow operations rarely translates to public victory. As Goldwater prepared for his 1964 presidential run, he found himself trapped between his public persona and private knowledge. He couldn't explain why he was so certain about communist infiltration without revealing the network. He couldn't moderate his positions without alienating the base that didn't know about his Catholic alliance. The irony struck him during a strategy meeting in Phoenix. Here he sat, planning a campaign that would paint him as an extremist, while knowing he had already compromised his principles for what he believed was a greater good. The very existence of the network contradicted his public calls for limited government and individual freedom. In October 1963, Spellman requested another meeting, this time in Chicago. The cardinal looked haggard, burdened by knowledge that showed in every line of his face. "We have a problem, Barry. There are rumors about Dallas." "What kind of rumors?" "The kind that sound insane until they happen. Kennedy's scheduled to visit next month. Our people are picking up chatter, not from communists but from others. Extremists who think Kennedy is the communist." Goldwater felt ice in his veins. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to warn someone without revealing how we know. Edgar is working his channels, but he's constrained by bureaucracy. You have contacts in Texas. Military. Law enforcement. People who trust you. If I start warning about assassination plots, they'll think I've lost my mind. Better that than the alternative." They parted with a plan for Goldwater to make discreet inquiries, to suggest increased security without specifics. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and suspicion of outsiders ran deep in Texas. His warnings, when they filtered through, were dismissed as political paranoia from a likely opponent seeking to embarrass the administration. On November 22, 1963, Goldwater was in his Senate office when the news came from Dallas. He sat frozen, phone in hand, as reporters sought his reaction to Kennedy's assassination. All he could think about was that midnight meeting 3 years earlier, when they had created their network to protect America. Had they failed in the ultimate test, or had their very existence contributed to the paranoia that led to this moment? Spellman called that night on a secure line Hoover had arranged. The cardinal was weeping. Goldwater could hear it in his voice. "We failed, Barry. God help us, we failed. We don't know, don't we? We created an atmosphere where everyone suspects everyone, where shadows have more power than light. Maybe we didn't pull the trigger, but we helped create the world where someone would." The network began to dissolve after Dallas, its members shaken by the realization of where paranoia could lead. Some continued their activities independently, becoming the kind of extremists Goldwater had always feared. Others retreated into silence, carrying secrets that would die with them. The 1964 presidential campaign became a bitter irony for Goldwater. Painted as an extremist by Johnson's campaign, he couldn't defend himself without revealing his moderation in the shadow world. His meetings with Catholics, his cooperation with federal law enforcement, his attempts to prevent violence, all remained secret while his public image solidified as a dangerous radical. The landslide loss to Johnson carried a personal sting beyond political defeat. Goldwater knew he had compromised his principles for nothing. The communist infiltration Spellman had warned about proved less dangerous than the American extremism their network had inadvertently fostered. The road to hell, paved with anti-communist intentions, led to a divided nation where conspiracy theories flourished in the soil of legitimate concerns. Years later, after Spellman's death in 1967, Goldwater received a package from the cardinal's executor. Inside was a single photograph, the two of them in that candlelit room, captured by a hidden camera Hoover had installed without their knowledge. The FBI director, ever the blackmailer, had documented even his allies' secrets. Goldwater burned the photograph, watching their younger selves disappear in flame. But he kept Spellman's final letter, delivered with the image. "Dear Barry, if you're reading this, I've gone to face judgment for our actions. I pray God understands we acted from love of country and fear for faith. But I fear we loved our earthly kingdom more than his heavenly one. You were right that night in Detroit. We became what we fought against. Men so certain of our righteousness that we created unrighteousness. The network was my idea, my sin. You tried to moderate what I would have made absolute. History will remember you as a conservative extremist. It will remember me as a prince of the church. Neither will know about those midnight hours when a Protestant and a Catholic tried to save America and perhaps helped wound it instead. Pray for me as I have prayed for you. Francis Joseph Spellman." The letter remained in Goldwater's safe until his own death, a reminder of how good intentions could corrupt absolutely when wedded to absolute power. In his memoirs he wrote obliquely about the period, "I learned that the greatest threat to America wasn't from Moscow but from those who would sacrifice freedom for security, who would create tyranny to prevent tyranny." Historians would puzzle over those words, searching for specific references in his public career. They wouldn't find them in speeches or Senate records but in the silence between words, the meetings that never officially happened, the alliance that existed only in shadow. The network's full scope never emerged into public knowledge. Participants took oaths seriously, carrying secrets to graves across denominational cemeteries. Occasionally, researchers would note odd patterns: how certain communist plots seemed to fail for unclear reasons, how information reached authorities through untraceable channels, how Catholic and Protestant anti-communists seemed surprisingly coordinated despite public tensions. But the real legacy lived in Goldwater's transformation. The man who entered that rectory in 1960 believing in simple solutions emerged understanding the complexity of power. His later career, marked by surprising moderation and unlikely friendships across ideological lines, grew from seeds planted in that candlelit room. He never spoke publicly about Spellman after the Cardinal's death, but visitors to his Arizona home noted a small photograph on his study wall: St. Patrick's Cathedral at night, rain-slicked streets reflecting light. When asked about it, he would only say, "A reminder that even good men can lose their way in the dark." The tragedy of the Shadow Alliance wasn't its failure but its success. It achieved much of what its founders intended: disrupting communist infiltration, bridging religious divides among conservatives, creating networks of concerned citizens. But the cost, measured in paranoia fostered and democratic norms eroded, proved higher than any communist threat. In 1986, as Iran-Contra revealed another generation's shadow operations, Goldwater watched from retirement with knowing sadness. He recognized the pattern: good men certain of righteousness, creating structures that escaped their control. When asked for comment, he said only, "Those who operate in darkness eventually become the darkness." His personal papers, sealed until 2025, supposedly contain fuller accounts of the network's operations. But even those who've seen previews suggest the real story lies not in operational details but in moral complexity: how a midnight meeting between unlikely allies created a template for both protecting and corrupting American democracy. The final judgment on Spellman and Goldwater's alliance remains unwritten. Was it a necessary evil that prevented greater catastrophe? A betrayal of democratic principles that fostered the extremism it meant to fight? Or simply a very human story of flawed men trying to serve both God and country, discovering too late that such service demanded choices they were unprepared to make? What remains certain is that in a candlelit room above Fifth Avenue, American conservatism changed forever. The union of Protestant skepticism and Catholic authority, forged in anti-communist fear, created patterns that would echo through decades. Every subsequent conservative alliance, every compromise between religious and political power, carries DNA from that midnight meeting. Goldwater died in 1998, taking most secrets to his grave. But nurses reported his final days were marked by conversations with unseen visitors. He would argue in his delirium, defending actions to judges only he could see. Once clearly he said, "Tell Francis I understand now. The darkness was in us all along." Whether he meant Spellman or some other Francis, whether the words carried meaning or were merely synapses firing in a dying brain, no one could say. But those who knew about the Shadow Alliance heard in those words a final confession: that in trying to save America from external threats, they had perhaps introduced a more subtle poison, one that would take generations to fully metabolize. The rectory room where it all began was renovated in the 1970s, turned into offices for Catholic charities. Workers sometimes reported strange experiences: papers moving without wind, whispers in empty rooms, the smell of candle wax where no candles burned. The church, ever practical about such matters, had the space blessed and ignored further reports. But in American politics, the ghosts of that meeting proved harder to exorcise. Every time religious conservatives allied with government power, every time security trumped transparency, every time fear justified extraordinary measures, the pattern repeated. Goldwater and Spellman's Shadow Alliance had ended, but its spirit lived on. A reminder that the road to tyranny is paved with patriotic intentions and blessed by those who confuse earthly power with divine will. The last known member of the network died in 2019, a retired FBI agent who had served as Hoover's liaison. On his deathbed, he told his daughter about meetings that never appeared in any files, operations that succeeded or failed without documentation, and two men, a Jewish Episcopalian and an Irish Catholic, who tried to save America in ways that perhaps endangered it more than any foreign ideology. "They meant well," he whispered before the end. "God help us all, they meant well." In the end, that may be history's verdict on the Shadow Alliance: not that it was evil but that it was human. In a world of clear enemies and unclear responses, good men chose shadow over light, secrecy over democracy, alliance over principle. Their successes remain largely unknown, their failures embedded in American political culture like shrapnel from an old wound. Barry Goldwater's public legacy as Mr. Conservative endures, but those who know where to look can see the other story: the midnight meetings, the impossible alliances, the compromises that seemed necessary until they became corrupting. It's a story without heroes or villains, only human beings caught between conviction and consequence, faith and power, the America they loved and the America they helped create. Somewhere in the FBI's classified archives, there may still exist recordings of that first meeting, Hoover's insurance against allies who might become enemies. Somewhere in the Vatican secret archives, Spellman's correspondence about the network might wait for future scholars. But the real record exists in what happened to American conservatism, how it learned to embrace any ally against perceived threats, how it justified extraordinary means for patriotic ends, how it created the very extremism it sought to prevent. The candles in that rectory room have long since burned out, but the shadows they cast stretch still across American politics, a reminder that those who fight monsters must be careful not to become them, and that the greatest threats to democracy often come from those most determined to save it.